This is Megan Jones from ICEA welcoming you to today's webinar, one of many presentations that were scheduled for our workshop in San Antonio, but will instead be presented today as a webinar. This and all of our distance learning series webinars this summer will count as an hour of training towards your CCEA certification, so make sure you keep your confirmation in your records for when it's time to renew your certification. With us today is ICEA's Region 1 Director, Arlene Minkiewicz from Price Systems, to present the fact that your project is Agile is not necessarily a cost driver. Arlene?
Thank you, Megan. And this is just a slide introducing Price. So if you're not aware of us, we have a suite of products that are created and supported to support the cost community and various things. We have estimating models, and then we have tools around those models. My name is Arlene Minkiewicz. I've been with Price for 36 years. I lead the cost research effort at Price. I've built and designed models. My expertise is software estimating, but I have gotten my hands into many of the cost models that we support. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll start with an introduction. Why did I decide to write this paper? And brief overview of what Agile is and what it means to be Agile and what it doesn't mean to be Agile, and how just because somebody says to you, well, I'm Agile, that doesn't tell you a whole lot of what you need to know without diving further into what that particular team means by Agile. We'll talk about some methodologies and rules of thumb for adapting an estimating process when you know the project is Agile. And we'll talk about some of the cost considerations. So we all use software estimating models. Well, maybe we don't all. Many of us use software estimating models of one sort or another, and they could be homegrown models. They could be a commercial model like the ones Price and Sear and QSM supply. And there's a bunch of cost drivers in there, and we might want to think about some of those cost drivers differently if the project is Agile. It doesn't mean the fact that the project Agile means that cost driver needs to be a 5 instead of a 6. It means that there's questions that you want to ask that might influence how you select values for cost drivers. Cover some useful Agile metrics and then wrap it up. Okay. Agile development practices have enabled organizations, have helped organizations get better at delivering quality software that's optimizing customer success and customer satisfaction, and the development team's success. So Agile practices aren't necessarily practices that make organizations more productive, although some of them do. But Agile practices are ones that think customer first, bring the customer in as early and as often as possible, and make sure that the software that's getting developed is the software that the most optimizes the customer satisfaction. Agile processes rely on highly skilled teams of development teams that communicate constantly with each other and with their clients. This does require some mind shift during the project planning, specifically from the development team's perspective and from the consumer of the estimates perspective. From a purely Agile perspective, estimation doesn't make sense, but we all know that, first of all, very few people, especially in our market space, are doing pure Agile. They're employing Agile processes and best practices to help improve the satisfaction of their customers and potentially to help improve the team's performance. But they're not purely Agile. If they're purely Agile, then you know when the release is going to be, you know how many iterations you're going to do. You know that when you get to that release date, the product is going to be released. You don't know necessarily what's in it, but doing an estimate on a project like that is really just math. But very few of the Agile projects that I have looked at in our market space are purely Agile, or utopian Agile, as one of my customers put it. And we still need to make estimates. So Agile, it's a philosophy. It's not a specific process. There is a general philosophy that all Agile teams apply, but they don't apply them all in the same way. There's lots of different frameworks for Agile. You've heard of Kanban, you've heard of extreme programming, things like that. and they all have different processes and different practices. So the fact that your project is agile may suggest a different approach to estimation. It's just not enough to inform an estimate without conversations that have to go on between the estimating team and the Agile development team or teams. So I always like to start off by, how did we get here? Software development was not, in its inception, treated as an engineering discipline. It was some sort of combination of art and science with maybe a little sprinkle of black magic. And improving technology increased complexity. And the difference between hardware and software at a very high level is, with hardware, you get to a point and you're stuck with what you got. You know, you might be able to change a few circuitries and things like that, but you know, if you've got prototypes of a tank, that's pretty much what your tank is going to look like. If you have prototypes of a software application, it's just not as fixed in stone as hardware is. And so there was that sort of artsy, sciencey, creativity component to software that was not well managed in the early days of the software industry, and in many cases isn't still all that well managed. So lots of projects started to spiral out of control because the combination of increased complexity, increased technology, and the fact that you can be creative created a situation where the industry was in trouble, was having a hard time delivering software on time. So a bunch of smart guys got together in the early 2000s and decided that we need to put the brakes on what we're doing. And many software projects, when I first went into the software development world, which I did software development before I started the cost research side of things, a lot of projects that were successful on the backs of a couple of heroes. And these smart guys who were talking about this manifesto, who created this manifesto, decided that that's just not a sustainable way to develop software. It's not a sustainable way to do anything. So the Agile Manifesto says, we are discovering better ways of developing software. We are valuing individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and response to change over following a plan. And what's important about this, and the reason I read it to you, is that the things on the left are valued more than the things on the right. It's not saying that we're going to not follow a plan or not do contract negotiation. It's going to say that we're going to value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So those things on the right still have to happen to some degree, and depending on the project and depending on the customer, the degree is greater or less. So this is the manifesto. This is sort of the credo of Agile projects and Agile teams. And pardon me, all Agile projects adhere to this manifesto at some degree. They all share a common set of principles, but each Agile project uses a unique set of Agile practices to implement these principles. And there are multiple frameworks, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. And each of those frameworks has a prescribed set of practices. But my experience has been that an Agile team that is doing Scrum might not, once again, they're applying the principles of Scrum. They may or may not apply all of the practices. So when you're doing estimating for an Agile project, it's like doing estimating for any project. You have to understand the project properties and the practices that are being employed. So what is Agile software development? Usable chunks of software are developed in short periods of time. Some people will call them sprints or iterations. So at the beginning of the project, the requirements are all loosely translated into a set of user stories or user scenarios. Or, once again, these things are called different things in different organizations and with different frameworks. But basically, the requirements as they're known at the beginning of the project are turned into stories and create what they call the project backlog. Each user story should deliver business value and should be small enough to be completed within the time frame of an iteration. Customers work with the team, and that's not always true. It is that utopian Agile where there's a customer representative sitting in with the team who can make split-second decisions when there's, do we go right or left? Those kind of decisions, they're right there. Oftentimes, that's not practical. Customers will still work with the team, but rarely are they co-located with the team, except on maybe very big projects. But the customer should be reviewing, or the customer's advocate, if the customer can't, should be reviewing the software regularly. So every iteration, at the end of every iteration, there's a release, and I'm using air quotes, which none of you can see, because it might just be an internal release. It might just be a release that goes to the customer. It's not a formal release where you have to, check all the installation software and stuff like that. It's an informal release, but it offers the customer an opportunity every 2 weeks or every month, whatever your iteration length is, to look at the software that they said was the most important to them, see if it's what they expected, decide maybe that's not exactly how I wanted it to be implemented. And here's, this has just become a higher priority than everything else in the backlog, is to spend the next iteration adding a feature to this particular story. So the customer is able every iteration to shift the priorities by moving things up and down in the backlog, because the backlog is originally prioritized, but it gets reprioritized when the customers start to see working software. And Agile teams embrace change. Agile teams have to be willing to say, wait a second, I spent 6 weeks making that work. I'm not going to change it. If the customer says, well, here's how I want to change, then the Agile team needs to embrace that change. So guiding principles for Agile development: customer satisfaction. As I said, change is welcome and embraced. Frequent deliveries of running software that has business value. There's a lot of emphasis on communication, face-to-face conversations, working with the customer, working with the team, and it tends to create trust and support. So in the kind of unflexible acquisition world that many of us live in, it's necessary to be able to create that trust and support between the customer and the development team. That's what makes Agile or partially Agile projects potentially successful in a less than flexible acquisition world. So there's some common practices that many Agile teams adopt. Pair programming. This is the situation where no production code is released that hasn't had at least 2 developers' eyes on it during development. It doesn't mean that 2 developers have to sit there all day and work together. But when a developer is ready to release the production version, which means to put it into the source control system and have it go into the next build of the application, another person has to get their eyes on it, not just to say, hey, you typed that wrong, but just, why did you pick this design? And did you think about this? So that 2 sets of eyes, it sounds like it might be a productivity buster as opposed to a productivity enhancer. And depending on how well it's implemented and overseen, it could be. It also could be a huge productivity saver because, person number 2 might have a 10 times better idea than person number 1 had. The fact that they talked about it makes the code better, saves time in the long run potentially. Continuous integration with automated testing. So this says this is a practice that once a day, once an hour, depends on the size of the project, once every time code is checked in, a build is run and a set of automated regression tests are run. And if any of the tests fail, people know right away. There's some sort of way to alarm or, a red flag or whatever that rises, and the team knows to stop what they're doing and fix the problem that got created by the last build. There's test-driven development. This means that when a user starts working on when a developer starts working on a test, the first thing they're going to do is write a test that will pass. If that task is, if they correctly implement that task in software, they write the test first and then write enough code to make that test pass. Many Agile teams have daily stand-up meetings where they discuss, here's what we did yesterday, here's what I'm going to do today, here's what obstacles are in my way that I want the team leader or the Scrum Master to help me solve. Teams are generally co-located. The practice of code refactoring basically means if you're visiting a piece of code to add some new feature to that piece of code, try to leave it a little better than you found it. Maybe add in a comment because there was code somebody else wrote that you didn't understand and you had to go to them. So put a comment in there so the next person doesn't have to do that. Maybe you see something that you could do a whole lot better. And if you're also doing continuous integration with automated testing, that means if you refactor and you were wrong and you messed it up, you'll know right away and you can go back to the way it was. Releases are small. The customer is on the team or supports the team. And simplicity is a common Agile practice. Don't, keep it simple, stupid. Don't make things more complicated because you just learned this cool new way to do things. So there's common Agile frameworks. There's extreme programming, where things like communication, feedback, simplicity, courage, respect are key practices. Feature-driven development, that's a Agile framework that focuses on functionality. Take one piece of functionality at a time, focus on that, plan on that, design it. Don't be distracted by other things that are going to come later. Kanban, you've probably seen pictures of the Kanban board. It's got 3 columns. To do, in progress, and done. It's a way that the team can keep track of where they are with respect to the project that they're working on. It's also a way that anybody in the organization who happens to stumble by where the team is working can get a very quick snapshot of how progress on that project is going. So Kanban practices including visualizing workflow, limit the amount of work in progress, don't get distracted, manage the flow, continuous feedback loops amongst the team with the customers, and use collaboration to help improve the team. But one of the most popular ones, Scrum, you have a product manager, you have a Scrum Master, and then you have your development team on a Scrum team. Iterations are time boxed. There are daily stand-ups, regular deliveries, and retrospectives. At the end of every iteration, a meeting is held with the team and preferably the customer and product manager, and the whole entire team sits down in a room and talks about, what did we do well this iteration? Where did we mess up? How can we do better next? And lean, the 7 principles of a lean include the elimination of waste, build productivity into your processes, create knowledge, defer commitment as much as possible. Once again, all of these frameworks seem to have a don't get distracted bend to them. Deliver fast, respect people. So those are some of the frameworks. It's not all of them. These are some of the most popular ones. But just looking at this slide, you understand that just because somebody says they're Agile isn't telling you enough about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And this slide also brings that point home. This is my favorite subway slide. This just shows the different kind of practices that happen for the different kinds of Agile frameworks. It just brings home the point that, once again, the fact that your project is Agile is not necessarily a cost driver, because there's a lot more you need to know than we're Agile. So, estimating Agile software projects. So it's sort of a conundrum around all software estimates, that when your first estimate is required, information is incomplete. So I'm guessing everyone on the line did not have to hear me say that to know that. But it's important, whether the project is agile or not, that the estimating team has a good understanding of the project, both technical and team parameters. It's paramount to a credible estimate. So how does the estimator respond when the development team declares agility? As I said earlier, if the team is truly agile, the estimate is easy because they know what the release date is, and whatever they get done by that date is what's going to go out. They know how many people are working on the project, so you don't need to do anything other than math. But most agile teams are not quite that agile, especially in our space. So programs are likely held to some or all of the following. There could be schedule constraints. It could be a firm fixed price. There is probably a set of fixed requirements, the minimum viable product. So while some requirements might be negotiable, while some aspects of requirements might be negotiable, there is a minimum viable product. You can't put out a contract for software without some idea of what software you're going to get. And the second category of agile teams, the ones that do have constraints, are generally those that have chosen to use agile best practices within the constraints of their contracts or their acquisition mandates. So the truly agile team, and I believe there's value in performing a formal estimate even if the team is truly agile, because it just adds credibility to the estimate that they've developed using simple math and helps eliminate or address uncertainty in what the agile team thinks they can do and what they think they can deliver. So at this far left, we know the team size. Most likely. We do know the team size and the length of iterations. We know when it's expected to be delivered. We know what the cadence is going to be, how often there will be deliveries before the final product is finished. And we know that there's agile practices, and we know what those are because we've had conversations as the estimating team with the agile team. So the estimator's job, in this case, early on in a project, apply their estimation methodology to what's known about the expected schedule and capability, and take into account specifics of the agile practices, and we'll talk about that in a little while, and offer both the agile team and decision makers advice about how feasible their schedule is based on standard estimation methodology around what they think they're going to do, and what the risk is that the expected capability will actually be delivered in the expected schedule. Significant variance between the two estimation methods should stimulate discussion and hopefully lead to convergence, either because the estimating team realizes there's things they didn't understand about the practices, or the agile team realizes they didn't take everything into account that they should have when they thought they could do that much in this amount of time. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. So we know what the capability requirements are, we know what the schedule constraints are, and we know what agile practices are going to be employed. Once again, because there's been a conversation. So the estimator's job in this case, it's not really different from a traditional estimate. They want to apply their estimation methodology to what they know, and they want to take into effect the effects of specific agile practices. And they want to create a cost and effort schedule estimate with uncertainty around the uncertain factors. The nice thing about working with an agile team, even if they're not of the utopian agile variety, if you're working with an agile team, one of the things that agile teams like to do is collect metrics. And you'll hear them talk about user stories, and I'm often asked the question of, if my agile team is talking in user stories, how do I translate that into some other size unit that makes sense to a model? Or why can't you have story points in your model, they'll say to me, and I explain that you can't have story points in your model as a metric because every team defines their own story points. What you can do is within a team or even within an organization, you can find ways to normalize story points around something more traditional like function points or use cases, so that over time you can create that conversation. But once again, the fact that the estimator is looking at it from a different perspective than the Agile team means there's a conversation. There's things you can talk about. There's metrics that can be compared to progress in the past. So Agile just really is going to focus on the value driven by the user. So we're going to look at what scope is going to change in an Agile project, where in a traditional project, scope is fixed and schedule and cost are going to have to, schedule and cost are the things that become variable. Okay, so what are some of the specific things that an estimator needs to be concerned about? Size, though it could change over the course of the project, there needs to be a starting place. I talked about calibrating for a team or coming up with a normalization across teams, that one story point maybe equals 100 source lines of code or 1,000 source lines of code or 15 function points. And teams collect metrics, and teams can, over time, because what happens with story points is, when you first spin up an Agile project, the team kind of has to come up with, okay, what is the story point going to mean to us? And at the beginning, it's hard because everybody's ideas are different, but the team gets into sync and in general gets really good at figuring out, that user story is 15 points and that user story is 30 points. They get good at it and they reach a cadence where that becomes a natural part of the thought process. Estimators concerned about the Agile team. What's the size of the team? What's their capability? What's the velocity of the team? How quickly can they deliver user stories? How long would the iteration be? How often will there be a release? So I said earlier that Agile teams tend to release working software at the end of every iteration. Those are generally informal releases that are shown to people that need to see them. They're not formal releases, but then there are obviously a project that's lasting months or years. You want to make interim releases so that capability can be available to the market. What's the release cycle? What else do we need to know about, like any other software development project? What else do we want to know about the team, the project, the program in general? So the estimator's job becomes determining schedule feasibility, number of iterations required, and uncertainty about the capability and the schedule. Okay. The fact that your project is Agile is not a cost driver. I have said that more than once, but that's sort of my point here. But there are cost implications to adopting Agile practices. So one of the jobs of the estimation team, especially an estimation team that's most experience has been doing more traditional projects, one of the things that they want to determine is what Agile practices apply and how those might impact the cost and schedule estimate. So some of the things you want to think about: Agile teams tend to be highly skilled. It is, if you are working in a co-located environment and you're working on a team that's determined to get this week's iteration done. If you're on Amazon or Facebook, you're not going to last long in that environment. So it's hard to be a slacker in an Agile environment because people work too closely together for that to be possible. Working closely with highly skilled team members, the learning curve for new members is quick. Whether the new members are novices at software development or whether they're just new to the program and project, they are in an ideal position to, if they have a question, spit it out, and the team will respond. And nowadays, a lot of that co-location is virtual, which doesn't totally make sense. A lot of that co-location is virtual, but Agile teams still have like a running mortarboard, which is the wrong word, just a running conversation that the whole team is involved in. So it's not as convenient as being able to say it out loud in a room full of your fellow workers. Almost as convenient. There's a lot of technology that's supporting the current work environment to make being on an Agile team easier, not just for that reason to make being on any team easier, but it greatly benefits Agile teams. So if your model has input parameters that indicate experience and level of knowledge of the team, you want to think about how you might want to adjust that, because this is a highly skilled team that works well together and has worked together on other projects. So take credit for that. That's going to increase productivity. Agile teams tend to have tool sets that are quite sophisticated. So especially if they're working on the kinds of software that requires compliance to standards or anything like that. But in general, they tend to have sophisticated tool sets, because, I mean, managing the Agile environment is trickier than managing a regular, just logistically trickier, you know, because you're moving things in and out of the backlog, and so tools are an important factor. Agile teams tend to have highly sophisticated tools, input parameters in a model that talk about tools or automation should be affected, should be considered to be affected. So co-location of teams should improve productivity. And my first bullet looks like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm really not. I do believe that it's a culture of interruption, but members get their questions answered in real time. And I think it definitely increases the cohesion of the team, because they're working together like a real team. They're all sort of pulling in the same direction. And there is this culture of interruption. And I think for most people that I talk to about this, it's hard to get used to that culture of interruption, but you start to get really good at not being interrupted by things that don't concern you, and just sort of in the back of your mind, filtering the conversations that are going on around you and figuring out where you could add value or you could learn something, and only let those conversations interrupt you, and not every conversation that happens. If you're lucky enough to have the stakeholders and the subject matter experts co-located with the development team, it creates a real team IPT. Once again, if there's not a customer representative at sort of the team's fingertips, that means sometimes decisions are going to have to be put off until the customer representative can be contacted and understands the problem. If they're right there, they listen to the whole conversation. You don't have to repeat yourself, and you are much more likely to get a rapid answer that's going to keep you from being slowed down by a situation or a problem. Well-run stand-up meetings increase productivity and quality. So yes, it's a culture of interruption. You can talk to the team members anytime. There's one time a day, y'all stand up and look at each other and say specifically what's good, what's bad, where do I need help? So if you have cost drivers in your model about the distribution of a team, about the communication practices, these I would consider as being impacted by a well-run Agile shop. Continuous integration with automated testing should absolutely, in my mind, and in my experience, not just in my mind, increase delivery productivity. So code is checked in frequently, and sets of regression tests are regularly run. Now, what's good about this is, in the old days, sometimes today too, but in the old days, almost every software project had time for requirements, time for design, time for implementation, then throw that all together and test it. And that could sometimes be 3 to 6 months. And that's not good, because if I make a change to the code and I check it in today, chances are really good that tomorrow I'll remember what I did and why I did it, and know exactly where to look for any failures that might come from the tests. So generally, in a shop that has continuous integration, the implementers are still running their own tests, but once you integrated it with all the other capability in the product, once you've done that integration, you're not going to run every single test on every single feature. That's what the regression tests do. So if you make a change in the code and all your tests run fine because you knew what you wanted to do and you knew how it was going to work and you wrote the code, but then when it gets integrated, it turns out that something that you're doing is conflicting with something that somebody else's feature is doing, not something that you would have caught in your standard testing. The regression test catches it, and then it's you or the other guy who put that feature. You know, there's two features that are competing with each other. There's two people who potentially caused the problem. They just potentially caused it within the last 24 hours. They're going to remember what it was. If you wait 6 months, that's not going to happen. So if things get fixed faster, a lot less time is spent tracking down bugs, a lot more time is spent just quickly knocking them out and being done with them. So if you have cost drivers that are focused on integration test complexity, then you would want to see how continuous integration impacts that particular input parameter, how it might. And all of those things, they're discussions. And these are not the only practices, agile practices, that may have productivity impacts. Like pair programming might have productivity impacts, and you'd want to try to find a way to model the fact that, and this might be more of a, if you're estimating quality, might be more of a higher quality than less cost or less effort. But it's important that the estimators have conversations with the Agile team or representatives of the Agile team in order to understand what they're doing differently than before they were Agile. Which practices did they adopt because of agility? And, how might that impact the productivity with which they develop software? Finally, just some useful metrics. As I said, many Agile teams have retrospectives at the end of each iteration. And in those retrospectives, one of the things they'll do is collect metrics. How many story points did we finish? How many defects did we find? How many defects did we fix? Agile team metrics are team specific. So each team defines how they're going to define these things. So common team metrics include things like stories or story points, how many stories per iteration or how many story points per iteration, how many defects have been found, how many have been removed. Over time, collecting information about how many defects were injected that didn't get fixed within an iteration and moved into another iteration or into the field. Velocity, how quickly does this team burn down stories? So there's different ways of showing velocity. There's a burn up chart that shows how much you've gotten done and how much still has to be done based on probably story points or whatever metric your team is using for size. A burn down chart just shows how much you've gotten done. Burn up chart shows how much more has to be done. And then keeping track of cycle time. So what's our cadence? How often are we getting our releases done in the time that we're planning to have our releases done? Unfortunately, team metrics are very valuable for the team. It helps them learn from their mistakes. It helps them keep track. It makes it possible for them to communicate with the organization. They're not good for project control in cases where there are multiple teams across a project. They can, however, find a way, because they're all collecting metrics. Every team should be collecting metrics. There should be a way to normalize metrics across a set of teams for project level control. And they're the same kind of metrics, but you can't just take team A's and team B's and add them together. You have to work with team A and work with team B to figure out how to normalize them and go from there. So some common project control metrics include, a burn up for an epic or a release. So an epic it's the big picture. Within an epic, there are releases that deliver sets of capability. And then within releases, there are iterations, and within iterations, there are stories. Terminology is not always the same, but that's the basic top-down Agile approach. So there's burn-up charts, burn-down charts at the epic and release level. Product backlog, what's the size of the product backlog in whatever normalized metric you're talking in, and how has the product backlog changed? So have stories been added to the product backlog since the beginning of the project? Have stories been removed? So changes aren't so much about changed priorities, but about changes to the actual set of capability that's being addressed. You want to look at defects. How many were injected? How many were removed? How many got delivered to the field? So, a certain set of latent defects end up going to the field. And it's good to keep track of that and try to reduce that number as a team or as a group of teams. And then over here on the right, there's a cumulative flow diagram that just shows, what have we done? What are we working on? What haven't we started yet? It's just project level. Here's where the project stands today. And then, number of features delivered is another common project metric. So that's what I had to say about estimating Agile projects. I don't have all the answers because Agile means different things to different people and different things to different teams. I do believe that Agile is a great way to follow the Agile Manifesto and the Agile Philosophy. I think that is an excellent way for lots of software projects and programs that I've been exposed to. I don't think it's for every program. There's some programs that are going to need a lot more rigor than you might have in an Agile development environment, but I think the paradigm's here to stay. I think current practices of Agile are limited, so I don't think that many Agile projects in this space are completely Agile, but and that's not a bad thing. I think applying Agile practices, best practices, helps teams, even if they can't be truly, we don't know what we're going to deliver till the day it's delivered. Whatever you decide you want, that's what you'll get. It doesn't mean it's bad that they've adopted Agile practices. In fact, I think it's a good thing. I think it helps teams. Estimators need to understand what Agile means. So you have to understand it in the context of the project that you're estimating. You have to understand it in the context of the Agile teams that are working on the project. And most importantly, you have to understand when someone says they're Agile, what are the best practices that they're utilizing and how might those make you think differently about how to estimate it? So the fact that your project is Agile is not a cost driver. It should start a conversation about how Agile practices may influence the cost estimate. Are there questions?
It says, you mentioned 2 ways that cost estimators can develop estimates with Agile teams. One you said was on the far left. Could you quickly review the second scenario?
Sure can. So the far left, what I meant by the far left is at the far left, you're working with a truly Agile team. At the other end of the spectrum, which is not necessarily all the way to the other end of the spectrum, but you're working with a team that is going to be Agile or going to adopt Agile practices, but are still going to have some constraints that you wouldn't have in a truly Agile environment. And from this perspective, it's almost this, it is the same as estimating any software project. You want to base it on whatever size they think they're going to work towards, and you want to base it on whatever schedule that they think they want, but you're still going to need to you're still going to need size and schedule as your main estimating drivers, and you can't just do the math like you could at the left end. I didn't do a good job of answering that. Sorry. Give me one more try. So this is really not different from a traditional estimate, except that knowing that the project is Agile, you want to have that conversation with the Agile team as to what that means when they say it's Agile and why they might think different factors are going to affect the estimate. I hope that made sense. If not, you can email me for further information if you'd like. I don't mind at all.
If Arlene, do you have a slide that shows your contact info?
Next is Bill Barfield. I unmuted you, and it looks like you're also on self-mute, so if you can unmute yourself, you can ask the question.
Arlene, good presentation. You mentioned uncertainty, which covers risk. How is risk more fully accounted for in an agile environment?
Do you mean cost risk, or do you mean risk in general?
Risk, all kinds of risk. There's cost risk, schedule risk, program risk. You know, you have to account for this uncertainty in some way, and it usually ends up being a dollar sign, the product.
And it's still, I mean, it still is. You're still going to do a risk analysis based on the fact that there's uncertainty, even in the size, even in the requirements. So I would recommend that, depending on how agile the project is, you're absolutely going to want to include that as part of your cost and schedule estimates. And in the same way that you would in any traditional project, except you want to understand the practices that are being used so that you're incorporating the right risk around those practices. Does that make sense?
Sure. So you could actually put different kinds of parameters that you discover in an agile environment, the number of users, delivery schedule and stuff, as input parameters into, say, crystal ball or at risk and so forth.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
Jeffrey?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, Arlene. Thank you for the presentation. Hopefully my question makes sense, but is there a simple answer to describing the differences between the limited agile you mentioned in government, kind of that we all work with, and iterative? I've seen maybe some databases or even just things described either way, and sometimes it's hard when you're speaking to folks to really give a good answer on what the difference is.
So you said between limited agile, which is what most of us do, and between like what I called utopian agile?
No, like iterative. Like some projects or some programs are labeled as iterative development project. Yeah, you'll hear them talk in iterations.
Gotcha.
But then in databases, there's also agile, and they do the same. So it's something I've come across recently, and I've wondered if either you have, or you can take it offline if you want. But
I mean, I'll try to give you a short answer, and if that's not adequate, we can communicate in more detail. But I mean, generally, when someone says they're using an iterative process, they're doing a lot of the same agile-like things, in releasing software regularly and things like that. Generally, iterations that are part of an iterative process are longer than the short little. They're delivering more than like one piece of business value every iteration. They're delivering a set of business value, and in general, it's not as responsive or embracive of change, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, that does help. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, Chelsea?
Nope, I think that's it.
Well, thank you all for your time.
So this is where I get to say our little plug. Arlene's presentation would have been presented at our workshop in San Antonio this year, but of course, as you all heard, there's this little bug going around that kept us from having the conference. So we're looking forward to being all together again in 2021. If you want to get in on this and get in and be one of our presenters in 2021, you can send in your abstract now. We will be accepting them until November 3rd. So we hope to see a lot of entries from you guys. We also have another webinar coming up next week. I believe it is Andy Prince next week. Yep, that's right, Andy Prince next week. And then we've got a webinar every Wednesday until August 26th scheduled. We look forward to scheduling some more for the fall as that comes up. So once again, if you didn't get to jot down Arlene's email and you have questions for her, you can go ahead and email the ICEA business office at ICEA@ICEAonline.org. We'd be happy to pass you along. We look forward to hearing from you guys next week and beyond. Until then, be safe, be good, be healthy, and be good to each other. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Megan.